Of all the political figures in American mythology, few loom larger than Huey Long. He's definitely one of the more interesting, complex, and enigmatic politicians of the 20th century. It has the unique distinction of being both claimed and rejected by every side of the political spectrum. Some people define him as a progressive and a socialist, but also as a fascist and a conservative. Perhaps he's a Christian Democrat, or just a plain old populist or American nationalist. The truth is, no one's really been able to define what Huey Long's political philosophy is beyond some sort of populism. When he himself was asked about it, he said, "Oh hell, just say I'm in a class of my own and let it go at that." Longism as a political ideology, much like Peronism or National Socialism or personalism under Diem in Vietnam, is very much an ideology that is based on its founder. It owes more to his personal idiosyncrasies, the cultural context he came from, and his life, than any kind of abstract political ideology. And when you look at the man to try to get some idea of what he believed, the situation doesn't get much better. On one hand, Huey Long was buffoonish, prone to cussing constantly, wore garish clothing, had abysmal manners. But on the other hand, he was very well read. He had a photographic memory. He skipped grades in school. He was granted a full scholarship to university. He studied by himself and was able to pass the state bar. And he was continually able to outmaneuver his opponents. He was seen to a certain degree correctly as a champion of the poor and downtrodden, and seemed to have genuine affection for them. But as governor of Louisiana, he failed to enact any kind of labor legislation, be it a certain number of work hours per week, child labor laws, a minimum wage. And from my understanding, average wages actually went down in Louisiana over his term as governor, and not just due to the Great Depression. While he did keep many of his campaign promises, he was also a pathological liar that would say just about anything to anybody and make up stuff about himself in order to appeal to whatever audience he was speaking to. For instance, sometimes pretending to be Catholic and sometimes pretending to be Protestant. He frequently quoted the Bible and used it as a cudgel to beat his opponents, despite by the time of his death not having been to church for years and living a hedonistic, hard drinking, hard gambling lifestyle. He claimed to be against the rich people, to be against the elites and such, but he lived, once again, a lavish lifestyle, staying at the top floor of hotels, spending tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on luxuries for himself, and pilfering probably tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of state funds. Ultimately, Huey Long is a case where you can read whatever you want into him. If you go into it sympathetic to what he did and the things he said, then you can read him as a hero of the common man who's unfairly maligned by elitist liberal historians who don't like it that a crass southerner came into the Senate and tried to shake things up. Or you can read it as a ruthless demagogue who bankrupted Louisiana, ran the most corrupt government outside of Tammany Hall in American history, and whose achievements crumbled very soon after their death. The truth is, these are both equally valid interpretations. Once again, probably the best comparison of Huey Long, and this gets made a lot, is to Juan Perón. Juan Perón did a lot of good things as president and a lot of bad things as president. Whether you think that the ends he achieved justified the means he took and the good outweighed the bad is very much kind of a personal opinion. And the ideological ambiguity only muddies the waters. So before we get into a bit more of his governing style, the things he did as governor, and the man himself, I think it's very important to look at the environment in which produced Huey Long. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm not a Southerner. I'm from Southern Ontario in Canada. And my ethics, how I view government as working, and my culture are very different from Huey. So while many of the things that he did were completely usual and commonplace in Louisiana politics, nowadays, especially if you come from another part of the country, it might seem rather extreme and kind of outlandish and difficult to interpret. Likewise, the level of poverty that people lived in during the Great Depression, particularly in the South, is something that we really have a hard time contemplating today. Even in the worst urban areas of America, obesity is, generally speaking, a bigger problem than starvation. The New Deal and the Great Society and the Square Deal ensured that pretty much everybody in America gets welfare now, often enough that they can kill themselves by overindulging on sugary and on other unhealthy foods. That didn't exist at the time. Louisiana didn't even have paved roads. It had one of the highest illiteracy rates of any state, and more or less had a semi-feudal class system with poor white peasants on one hand and rich aristocratic urban elites in New Orleans at the other. Louisiana even had a poll tax whose purpose was not just to prevent blacks from voting, but to prevent poor whites from voting as well. While a lot of Huey Long's behavior, his garish suits, his swearing, his bawdy jokes, his general disdain for protocol, his disdain for any kind of formality, while to a lot of other people it may seem kind of buffoonish, in the context of Louisiana, particularly in the context of his base in rural Louisiana, they absolutely loved that kind of stuff. People who would meet Huey Long in person and get one of his jokes or see him clown around or give a crazy speech or something, they would remember him and they would become lifelong voters. He had a philosophy that name recognition was everything and there's no such thing as bad publicity. And to a certain extent, he was right. Whenever it came to an election, everybody at least knew who he was when they looked at the ballot. How many senators from the 1930s can you name? I can't even really think of too many, to be honest, but I definitely do remember Huey Long. So that's a mark in his favor. You can say a lot of things about him, but low profile and forgettable he was not. At the time of his death, it seemed that his populism, his rhetoric was very effective outside of the South, and he was making big inroads with farmers and factory workers and miners all across the country. And he may have been able to build a political coalition that would at least act as a spoiler for Roosevelt, if not outright defeat him. That being said, let's get into Huey Long's term as governor. So, reading about Huey Long's term as governor, it's kind of fascinating that something like this could even exist in the 20th century, specifically the 20th century in America. It reads like something out of the antebellum South, or the something like from Gangs of New York, or the really old school Tammany Hall days. But no, all this stuff happened in the late 20s and early 1930s. In an ostensibly liberal democratic, no pun intended, society. At the same time, though, once again looking at Louisiana, most of the things that he did were very common. Electoral fraud was extremely common, abusing the civil service system and giving jobs to your friends, giving no-bid contracts, bribing people, blackmailing people. This was all stuff that the old political elites did all the time. It's just that Huey was a lot better at it than they were, and he was able to do it on a much larger scale than they could. So let's kind of finally get into the politics of the situation. So Louisiana at the time was a one-party state. The Republicans didn't even bother to run candidates in many of the gubernatorial elections. So the actual governor election was the Democratic primary. Whoever won that, there was a 99.99% chance that they would become governor. The Democratic Party of the 1920s and 1930s is not the Democratic Party of today. It's kind of difficult to describe, being this strange mixture of Northern liberals, Southern conservatives, Christian Democrats, and kind of a mismatch of different stuff. The Democratic Party, though, in Louisiana tended to be very conservative, both in terms of their economic and social policies. The rural parts of the state were considered to be quite unimportant and there was little investment in them, whereas the old gang in New Orleans more or less controlled everything. Huey Long came from the rural parts of the state, and he campaigned extensively there. He was also one of the first Democrat politicians to really break into the Cajun areas and kind of overcome the religious divide. That's always kind of an issue in a lot of parts of the U.S., where Protestants are often very. There's always been this fear in America that Catholics were actually loyal to the Pope, and a lot of evangelical Christians and Baptists and stuff really dislike Catholics. Huey Long, though, didn't really care. He would tell people he was Catholic. There's an interesting story in the book where he said, I got up at 6 in the morning and drove my Catholic grandparents to Mass. Then I came back, and at 8 a.m., I would drive my Baptist grandparents to their church. And someone's like, I didn't know you had Catholic grandparents. And he goes, hell, I didn't even have a car. So he would kind of campaign on that. Once again, he was kind of the first person in Louisiana to really go to these people and say, look, I get your issues. You're poor. You don't have roads. Your kids can't go to school. Because to go to school, you needed textbooks, and no one could afford textbooks. So a lot of the rural kids didn't even go to school. The state university system wasn't very good. The hospital system was once again very old, outdated, and in desperate need of funding. And Huey said, look, the aristocrats in New Orleans are screwing you. They don't like you. And I'm going to take their money, and I'm going to change the system so that all of you can share the wealth. And every man will be a king, but no one will wear a crown. And it's a lot of people like to compare Huey Long to Donald Trump. And I do see there is a strong aspect of that. Huey Long, as with Donald Trump, part of his appeal is he doesn't seem to have a contempt for the average person. He would go to these people who would be considered hillbillies or rednecks or despised by kind of people in the North, and he'd talk to them in their own language and pay attention to them, and really, they would really get the impression that he cared about them personally and that he was interested in what they had to say. And Huey Long had a photographic memory, so he would remember everybody he had previously met. And he used to be a traveling salesman, and he would remember all the people he met from back then. And he'd be like, oh, you put on a couple pounds, or oh, you're going bald. And the people he said that to would become lifelong voters. Like, once again, if you go to the American election of Hillary versus Donald, Hillary called Trump supporters a basket full of deplorables. Obama said they're bitter clingers who cling to God and guns and antipathy towards people who aren't like them, and just kind of had an outright disdain and hatred for the average American. You can say a lot of things about Huey, but he definitely never really displayed that. At least not directly. So he went to the people with all these promises, and he was kind of able to win in an upset election and become the governor of Louisiana. And once he took power, he really, really took power. In the US, governors have a lot more power over the president, especially back then. So when he took power, he pretty much fired every single person that he possibly could. At all different levels of the state, he just fired everybody and replaced them with his own people. And the people he couldn't immediately fire, he would do stuff like cut all the funding to their departments. They couldn't even draw a paycheck until they quit. And then when they quit, he'd replace them with somebody who was loyal to him and then fund it again. He would redraw congressional boundaries to make it basically certain that they were going to lose their next election. He liked to abolish boards and entire departments of the government. And when they were abolished, then everyone would obviously get laid off from that. And then he would reform the Bureau exactly the same and hire all of his loyalists. The number one criteria to get a government job in Louisiana or to attain any kind of personal power was personal loyalty to Huey Long. And a lot of us immediately bristle at that. We say, this is ridiculous, this is absurd, he should be hiring the most competent, qualified people. He should be putting technocrats into these positions, people who have education and experience. And there is something to be said for putting qualified people of good moral character into positions. The thing is, though, you can get into a situation once again like the one Trump was in, where basically he was in office but not in power. He could issue whatever executive orders he wanted. He could tell Republican Congress to do whatever he wanted, but none of them would do it. They would just completely ignore him. And he was just kind of screwed. He was stuck in the water, and all these competent civil servants, all these like technocrats, none of them would do what he told them to do. So honestly, he probably would have been better off if he could just firing everybody in the federal government and replacing them with random Trump supporters from the Midwest or Montana or something, because they'd actually do what he'd want them to do. One of the things that Huey Long did, which I think is funny, is whenever he would appoint judges, he would just literally appoint random Long supporters. People who just barely had a law degree, had never really even been in court, and he just make them high-ranking judges because they would vote the way that he wanted them to vote. And once again, I can't help but think this is largely a good idea. This is an issue conservatives always get into, where they want constitutionalists and originalists and people who will interpret the Constitution the way the Founding Fathers intended. And people on the left will just appoint judges who are hacks who will just do what they want them to do. And that's kind of a policy I think conservatives should accept. Just pick people who are hacks who are going to vote the way you want them to vote, and who cares about their judicial integrity. We're way past that at this point. The fact that Long did that meant that he could basically just get past whatever he wanted, and there was no court challenges to any of it. Perón did something similar in Argentina, where the Argentine Supreme Court kept striking down his legislation, so he just got the Peronist Congress to impeach them all. Huey Long also had a number of other kind of fascinating schemes that I can't believe he got away with. He garnished the wages of all the state employees. So all state employees had to pay something like 10 to 20% of their salary to the Huey Long election campaign. And so he always had this massive slush fund. This was also a good way of embezzling state money, because he massively expanded the number of state jobs and public works programs during his time in office. So each new job he created would be more kickbacks into his pocket and the pocket of his political machine. He also founded his own newspaper, Louisiana Progress, which became American Progress, and he made it mandatory that everybody, all the members of the Louisiana Civil Service, had to subscribe to the newspaper. So it became one of the biggest dailies in Louisiana. I mean, that's one way to do it. You just tell everybody to buy your book. I mean, I guess it worked for Hitler. You just make it mandatory reading that people buy your newspaper, and they buy your newspaper. Well, the State House initially stopped some of his pieces of legislation. The Long machine just had so much money and so much personal popularity that over the next couple elections, he was able to get all his candidates elected, and they would just do literally whatever he told them to do. So there would be days where he'd like stay up all night writing something like 40 bills, come in and just be like, don't even read them, just everybody sign off on this. And they'd get like 40 bills passed in an hour or two. And while initially he had to directly bribe or threaten people, a good way of doing that is if they have a family member who worked in a job that was somewhat dependent upon public funding or the state. Also keep in mind that this was during the Great Depression, so the government was a disproportionately large employer at this point in time, especially in the South, especially in Louisiana. So it wasn't hard to find a family member who might conveniently lose their job if someone was not to vote the right way. The newspapers despised him, so he forced through a tax on their ad revenue. There's also a thing in Louisiana where, at the time, where a specific paper would be chosen by a municipality to publish like announcements and stuff like that. So he passed laws allowing him to control that. So newspapers who ran bad things about him, he barred them from being able to publish government announcements and stuff like that, which deeply hurt their ad revenue. New Orleans and Baton Rouge were always kind of hotbeds of anti-long activity because he raised taxes on rich people and scared away investment from the state. So he would just do stuff like cut the budget to New Orleans. He passed legislation that the fire department and the police department of New Orleans were just directly under state control. It just took away all their autonomy of New Orleans and all their money until they eventually came crawling to him and begged him to have mercy on them. Long was more or less able to just steamroll literally everybody in the state and gain absolute dictatorial power in a couple of years. And I got to admire the man for his energy, for his ability to take charge, and to actually get things done. Much like someone like Napoleon, you can say a lot of things about Huey Long, but you can't say he didn't get things done. I think it was when Farmer, who someone was interviewing, and they said Huey Long is like a corrupt kleptocrat, and they're like, he may be corrupt, but at least he's corrupt, and I got a road, whereas the previous government was corrupt. Now, when Huey came to power, to his credit, he did do a lot of things for the poor of Louisiana. He massively expanded the highway system. There was basically no paved roads. He built roads all over the state. There were new bridges. He brought in natural gas to New Orleans and some other areas that dramatically lowered fuel prices. He reduced the tax burden on the poor. He eventually got rid of the poll tax so poor whites could vote. He massively expanded the number of government jobs so a lot more people got work. He doubled the number of beds in the state's hospitals. He implemented a free school book program. I always hate the term free. I just prefer to say government provided school book program. So all the kids in the state could afford to go to university. They also introduced night literacy classes for adults. And I think it's tens of thousands, if not like 100,000 adults went through it and became literate. So another thing is he greatly increased the scope and scale of University of Louisiana, turning it from basically a backwater into one of the biggest, into a big nationally renowned university. Just lavishing money on it, allowing them to get the best scholars, giving them the biggest pool in the country, rebuilding stuff. It's just almost every aspect of Louisiana was changed by him. You could argue that he dragged the state kicking and screaming into the 20th century. Also, even if some things didn't work out in the long term, it's hard to blame him for the fact that the Great Depression was still going on. It's not as if anywhere in America was really doing well at that point in time. So if his policies didn't immediately fix things, it's not like Roosevelt's policies were fixing things either. The U.S. didn't really get out of the Depression until World War II, if my understanding is correct. On the other hand, though, things aren't exactly how they seem. While he did build a lot of roads, a lot of the roads were unsafe. They were no bid contracts. They were poor quality because a large portion of their budget was skimmed off the top. A lot of them washed away within a decade or two. It became a massive financial drain on his successors to have to pay the upkeep for these poorly built roads. A lot of the bridges didn't really last very long. They had to be refitted or torn down. He didn't do a ton for, some people argue, aside from the school books and making school more accessible, he largely ignored education. There were other universities in Louisiana that he didn't lavish funding upon. I think there was, they built a massive pool there, and upon finding out that there was a pool in California that was like 2 feet longer, he ordered them to completely rebuild the pool. He rebuilt the governor's mansion. He rebuilt the state capitol. But once again, I'm reading a largely unsympathetic biography of him called Kingfish. And I think it does kind of minimize a lot of his achievements and make the situation look worse than it did. But once again, you can say whatever you want about the quality of these things. He at least got it done. Even if it only lasted a couple decades, farmers were able to drive trucks on the road for the first time. Rather than having these gravel dirt roads, trucks could come to their farms and deliver things and pick up produce. They were now literate. They had affordable natural gas. And that kind of came down to it, was people were like, yeah, Huey Long is super corrupt and embezzles stuff, but the previous government embezzled stuff, and at least I get a road. At least he's done something tangible to improve my life. And that's often something you don't see for your tax dollar. A lot of it's very abstract and far away, but if you get like a hospital built in your community, or a road built, or a school, that is something tangible. That's something you can look at and say, my tax dollars actually went into that. The other downside of kind of Huey Long's reign was Louisiana racked up one of the largest state debts in the United States, and Huey was constantly implementing new taxes in order to pay for his ever-expanding building program. Once again, you have to keep in mind that whatever money was spent, I don't know the exact proportion, but I'd imagine it wouldn't be unfair to say for every dollar spent on actually doing something, a quarter of that probably went into his pockets or the pockets of his cronies. And then on top of that, you also had the people he was paying had to give part of their salary as well. There's a lot of other sleazy stuff that happened. Louisiana was one of the biggest oil producers in the US at the time. So he would pass legislation to lease state land to himself and his closest political allies, and then they'd sublease it out to Standard Oil. So they might lease out land for like $100, and then they'd sublease it out for like $1 million to Standard Oil. And a lot of that money probably could have gone to the state. It could have gone into funding some of these ambitious public works projects. So what we have to say is, was Huey Long a effective politician who was able to get his agenda done extremely quick, who brought about massive, real, tangible improvements from the people of Louisiana? Yes. Was he a kleptocrat who bankrupted the state and stole untold millions of dollars in order to pay off his political cronies? Yes. Once again, you have to look at it in the context of Southern politics and Louisiana politics at the time. While he was better at stealing money, it's not as if the previous administration didn't, and people felt good about it. And this kind of brings us, we're going to talk a bit about what his plans were for the rest of the country. Huey Long had an ego roughly the size of Texas, and was convinced that all of America, not just Louisiana, would need to feel the love of Longism, that every man in America would have to be a king, not just every man in Louisiana. And so he ran for Senate in one of the most corrupt elections in American history. It was pretty funny, some of the stuff that happened, where there's a guy who's like, only 2 people in this district are going to vote against you, Huey. And then no one voted against him in the district. And he's like, what happened? And the guy goes, those 2 people changed their minds. You know how it always goes. There's the entire graveyard of New Orleans was voting. They were collecting like 50% more votes than there were registered voters in a parish. There was just massive electoral fraud on every level. Being governor, he just passed bills that allowed him to appoint electoral commissioners. So he just appointed his own electoral commissioners. He was elected senator, but didn't take his seat for 2 years to finish off his term as governor. What's funny is later there was an investigation by the Senate that found that there was mass election fraud, but they didn't throw him out of the Senate because they determined he probably would have won legitimately even without the massive election fraud. Which, to be honest, I find quite funny. It's kind of funny when Huey Long left being governor of Louisiana. He basically took like the most pathetic yes man he could find, and he's like, "You're going to be governor, and you're just going to do exactly what I tell you to do." And the situation was so bad, and Huey Long mocked this guy so much that whenever Huey Long was in Baton Rouge, he made the governor go work in like some side office, and he took over the governor's chair, despite not having any official role in the state and being the senator. He would just periodically come back from Washington to pass legislation. He continued to write it himself during his time in the Senate, and the long political machine in no way stagnated or decayed by him being a senator. So basically, everybody else in the Senate despised him. He had no respect for decorum. He would give bombastic speeches. He would constantly filibuster. He went to war with the president. He thought that the New Deal didn't go far enough. Also, he didn't like it that people liked Roosevelt. His ego was just that big. It's kind of funny because someone asked if he would accept nomination as vice president, and he said Huey Long isn't vice anything. And it's around this time that we start to get into the share our wealth clubs that started across the country and the every man a king share our wealth movement. The idea was they were going to cap individual fortunes. I think the number was $100 million. And any money above that was going to be confiscated and redistributed. There was going to be extremely high wealth and income taxes. The idea being, actually, Huey was the one who coined the whole 99% meme, or like the 1% own more than the 99%. Whether or not that was actually true at the time, who really knows? Huey had an interesting relationship with the truth. So his idea was, we're going to confiscate the money of the rich people. We're going to give it to the poor. We're going to have minimum income. We're going to have old age pensions. We're going to have health care. We're going to have all this stuff. It's going to be this utopia. It's not communism. It's not socialism. It's based on the Bible and the Constitution. Personally, I think this would have been an unmitigated disaster. For a lot of reasons. There's not really an easy way to divide up large capital assets. You kind of need industrialists to do certain things. It does remove the profit motive from people who have higher incomes. There's just a lot of problems with share of wealth that maybe I can discuss in another thing. I also just don't like wealth confiscation. Taxation is legitimate, but I don't like that. I also don't like that Huey Long wanted a really strict inheritance tax. I don't like inheritance taxes. I think it's a form of theft because the person had already paid taxes on the money. And one of the most basic principles of civilization is wanting to leave a legacy to your descendant. And I don't like stuff like that. So there was no real plan to implement this. I think Huey just thought he was going to send the army in and just manually grab people's money. The socialists really hated it because they viewed him as like a reactionary. He wasn't a Marxist. He wasn't like a doctrinaire socialist. He was Huey Long. And they didn't like Huey Long because Huey Long was a Southerner. Huey Long was quoting the Bible and stuff like that. And that wasn't a good thing. That wasn't their brand of socialism. And of course, Huey Long was assassinated before he could run for president. His 4D chess plan was to basically act as a spoiler, was to run as a third party candidate, possibly on the Progressive Party or as an independent. And he couldn't beat Roosevelt because Roosevelt was too popular. But his hope was that he could split the vote enough that a Republican could win. And then the Great Depression would continue on. And then he could run against the Republican in the election after that and become president. Which honestly isn't that bad an idea. Roosevelt probably wouldn't have run again anyways because of his illness. And without Roosevelt, he was kind of the clear front runner. So it's not a bad plan, but of course he got shot because he went too far with basically screwing people. And the father-in-law of the son-in-law of one of the people he screwed over by gerrymandering to make them lose their, I think it was a judge, to make them lose their judicial seat, got pissed off and shot him. And ironically enough, he was operated on by an unexperienced, somewhat inept doctor who he had appointed the head of the hospital because he was a personal loyalist. So it kind of came back to haunt him a bit. The whole choosing people based on political reliability over their actual skill at their job. But this kind of brings us to his legacy. Like I said, a lot of people on the left claim Huey Long, a lot of liberals, a lot of socialists, a lot of progressives, but also a lot of conservatives like him as a good old fashioned Southern boy, as someone who stood up to the liberal elites, who stood up to the Northerners, who showed the Washington fat cats and Standard Oil and the bankers what the American people can do. It's kind of cringy to bring it up, but in these circles, he's very popular, in part because he's a meme in the mod for Hearts of Iron 2 called Kaiserreich, and he's the head of the right-wing populist American Union State, and a lot of people think that's based, so they identify with him, and he's kind of become a bit of a meme. Also, he's undergone a bit of a renaissance because of his similarities to Trump. Just a side note, something interesting with Huey Long, and this is also an issue with Trump, is if your voter base tends to be pretty conservative people, it can be pretty easy to go from being folksy to being crude. Like, you can go from making jokes and swearing and stuff to doing something sexual or blaspheming or something, and that can really piss off your base. Which is something Trump periodically ran into during his various campaigns. But I think there's this impression that Huey Long was some sort of a conservative because he quoted the Bible a bunch and because he didn't really take strong positions on a lot of issues like race. Now, to Huey Long's credit, he was one of the first Southern politicians in a long time to not race bait, to not just blame everything on blacks, to just say they were the big problem, we can't do anything, etc. His campaigns largely avoided the topic of race because he felt that class warfare was much more effective, which it was. My narrative of the Civil War is kind of that the Southern upper class didn't want to pay white people to do the job that black slaves would do, so they lied to the Southern lower class and told them it was about states' rights and got them to basically fight for their economic self-interest. I'm sure some people will get angry about that, but I think that has a certain degree of accuracy. So Huey was just like, okay, we can blame black people, but let's not do that. Let's just blame the upper class who is more visible and has a more direct impact on their lives. A lot of the rural areas didn't even have many black people. Anyways, they lived in urban centers or they lived in different parts of the state. So the people there didn't like black people, but it wasn't like that high in their list of concerns. Also, you have to keep in mind that this was Louisiana. This was like redeemed South, the redeemed South before the Civil Rights Act, before Johnson, before Kennedy. It was just conservative there. Just a lot of things that we would have today, like gay marriage, like forced integration, the ending of freedom of association. Actually, he did try to bring in gun restrictions. I was going to say gun restrictions, but Huey Long was ironically justified in not liking guns because he was afraid that someone was going to try to kill him, and someone did eventually shoot him. But just a lot of the trans stuff, a lot of the feminist stuff, just none of that was like really a thing in the South. Regardless of how kind of liberal or conservative a politician was, that stuff just kind of wouldn't be brought up. So even if Huey Long was like a leftist and like a progressive, he was a Southern leftist and a Southern progressive. And looking back at like kind of a leftist from the South from the 1930s and 20s makes him look like an ultra conservative by today's standards. Keep in mind that Roosevelt stated in one of his speeches that the war against Nazi Germany was about preserving Christian civilization, and he issued Bibles to his soldiers. If a Republican did that today, he would be impeached. It is to a certain extent a testament to how much society has changed and how far it's gone in a certain direction that Huey Long is considered like this far right ultra social conservative when he behind the scenes was a heavy drinker, a heavy gambler. He did crack down briefly on gambling and prostitution as a way of placating his base. But more so than that, he accepted these things so long as they paid him money. So was Huey Long a conservative? Not really. He just was conservative by the fact that he was like a left-wing populist from an extremely conservative state in which none of the modern social issues would even have been like thinkable or would have even been raised. Likewise, when we talk about his use of the Bible, a lot of it really does sound like something a liberation theologist would say. Using just kind of parts of the Bible taken out of context to justify his political program. Who knows really how sincere he was about it. And that's kind of how you have to look at Huey Long. Was he sincere? Was he not sincere? Was he a man of the people? Was he not? I think ultimately he was a mixed bag. He was someone who got a lot of things done, and I think that you can learn a lot about from how to effectively exercise power, ensure political loyalty, and get your agenda done. But who was by no means this like third positionist, like super based Christian socialist that is kind of built up by a lot of the modern dissident right. He was a product of his time. He was a megalomaniac, extremely corrupt, but unlike a lot of very corrupt and like politicians, he at least got things done. So I think that's the most you can say about Huey Long. And for any politician to have that asterisk next to your record that you actually got something done is no small feat. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry if it went a little long, but there was a lot to cover. These take a while to do because I have to get like notes together on what I want to cover. And this was after I read a biography of him. So the biography, if you're curious, was Kingfish by Richard D. White, which is not a very favorable biography, but it's not completely unfavorable to him either. So, God bless. I hope you enjoyed the video, and talk to you guys again real soon.